If you're watching us August 6th, starting at 8 p.m., then you're watching us live. Thanks so much for being here. Our show tonight is Oregon Campaign Finance Reform, and we have two experts here, especially Mr. Meek. Dan Meek is a public interest attorney, and you've been pursuing this like the white whale for a long time, I guess. But, I mean, you're bound up in it, and may God hold your hand so you're successful.
20 years, that's all.
20 years. Incredibly important. And our own Moses Ross.
Hello.
Actually, I don't have conjunction.
Good to see you guys.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
And what an interesting, please, who wants to lead off?
Well, let me do some introductions
Sure.
of Dan. And
Please.
Part of the motivation for me, at least, to have Dan on our show again is many of you may know that a real passion of mine over the past couple of years has been to establish some form of campaign finance regulations here in the state of Oregon, reform here in Oregon. It's a real challenge because Oregon, as you'll learn here soon from Dan, is is in the bottom half, is 49th out of 50 states as far as public disclosure of donors, and so we have a real problem here in Oregon, and I think we fundamentally change it by revising the laws surrounding campaign finance so that there's more transparency, so that the common voter is able to have an influence, the same amount of influence as, say, a big corporation would have, and make our politicians more responsive to the public. So I've been working on this since 2015. We've had some real success in Multnomah County. We got a campaign finance reform passed in addition to the charter in Multnomah County mandating campaign finance reform, campaign contribution caps, definitions on who can contribute, and transparency as far as disclosure requirements. And so we got that passed in Multnomah in 2016, and then we went and took it to the city of Portland and got it passed in the city of Portland by a measure, using a ballot measure there. Same thing, but with much more detail. And the city of Portland, to their credit, has really run with this over the last year. And the upcoming election will be run using these new requirements. And so that's very exciting. Now, along the way, through this coalition that we built in campaign finance reform, we get to meet some really passionate people and dedicated people like Dan Meek. Dan Meek is a public interest attorney for the last 20 years here in Oregon. He has worked on a variety of different issues, ranging from the Trojan nuclear plant to campaign finance reform, and he's been a real advocate for campaign finance reform. And so what I'm hoping to do and to share with you folks tonight is kind of the lay of the land, where we have been, where we are at, and where we are going through the eyes of someone that's helping to craft that strategy and that path with Mr. Meek. So Dan, thanks. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, I've been doing public interest attorney work here in Oregon actually for 32 years, but the campaign finance reform only for the last 20.
Only.
So it's kind of a new topic for me.
Well, and let's talk about that for a second. You say you've been focusing on that for 20 years. That kind of your original early success was a statewide measure that passed in 1996. Is that correct?
No, I wasn't involved with that measure. There was a good campaign finance reform measure that Oregon voters passed overwhelmingly with about 73% of the vote yes in 1994, and that was the one that the Oregon Supreme Court then struck down in 1997 in a decision called Van Natta versus Kiesling, which is actually a horrendously bad decision. It's Citizens United on steroids. It's far worse than the later Supreme Court decision called Citizens United that was in 2010. What the 1997 Van Natta decision said is that making a political contribution by itself is protected speech and cannot be limited. Now, Oregon has the same freedom of speech clause as 37 other states, down to the same words exactly. No other state court in any other state has held that its freedom of speech clause prevents limits on campaign contributions. Only the Oregon court has decided that. And you mentioned that we have passed ballot measures now in Multnomah County and Portland in the last 2 years with massive overwhelming majorities of 87 and 89%. Those matters are now in court. The Multnomah measure will be going before the Oregon Supreme Court for oral argument on November 1st. We're already halfway through the briefing cycle for it. And so it'll give the current Oregon Supreme Court a chance to overturn the big mistake that the justices made back in 1997.
And that mistake in 1997 was a ruling that said that they could have unlimited contributions, and in the state of Oregon it was equivalent to free speech. And so the plan, I'm assuming that by getting it back in front of the Oregon Supreme Court, you feel that they're going to make a different decision?
Yes, I would think so. It has been, we have, of course, very carefully analyzed the 1997 decision and have refuted it in every single particular. And strangely enough, we now have folks on our side who have never been on our side before in this matter. There was an amicus brief on our side filed by Governor Kate Brown.
Wow.
There was an amicus brief filed on our side on contribution limits by the American Civil Liberties Union of Oregon, which has routinely filed lawsuits against our campaign finance reform measures in the past. So they've done a 180. So we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, we still have unlimited campaign contributions in Oregon. If we can take a look at a few of my illustrations here. Oregon really has a national reputation for having terrible campaign finance regulation. The Center for Public Integrity, back at the end of 2015, gave Oregon an F in many measures of fighting corruption, including political financing. Are we able to use the slides? No. No?
Not at this time. Okay.
Well, what we can say is, according to the graph of the image that we were going to use, there was a national study that they did, and Oregon got very low grades, Fs and D minuses on a range of information, on a range of points from public access to information. They got an F. Legislative accountability, they got a D minus, which was their highest grade. So, and that relates back to the finance regulations and where Oregon's standing with that as well, correct?
True, and the study by the Center for Public Integrity also ranked the states in terms of their quality of their control of political financing, and they ranked Oregon the worst in America, with the single exception of Mississippi.
Well,
the result of the decision by the Oregon Supreme Court in 1997 has been that spending on Oregon campaigns for governor has increased by a factor of 20-fold. Back in 1998, only about $3 million was spent by all campaigns in the campaign for governor.
Yeah.
In 2018, that was over $40 million, with each candidate spending over $20 million. The contribution that received the most notoriety was by former chairman of Nike Corporation, Phil Knight, who contributed $3.425 million to the governor campaign of the Republican Newt Buehler. I looked up all of the national data, and it turns out that's the third largest campaign contribution by an individual in the history of the United States, by an individual who is not the candidate himself or herself, or not in the candidate's immediate family, like a spouse.
So
third biggest ever in the United States.
well, it sounds like a very blatant attempt to buy influence.
Well,
I mean, a $3 million attempt.
True, and there were other contributions that are more in the range of what is typical in Oregon, and of course very unusual in any other state, in governor's candidates. The head of NTEC Corporation contributed $350,000. The head of ADEC Corporation, which is a medical equipment, a dental equipment dealer, dental equipment manufacturer, $350,000. Henry Swigert of ESCO, $283,000. Many different executives of timber companies in the range of a $250,000. Now, despite all of those extremely large contributions, Newt Buehler was actually outspent by Kate Brown. She raised even more. She raised $2.2 million from the Democratic Governors Association, which itself receives its funding from corporations, unions, and wealthy individuals. And she also received $750,000 from Everytown for Gun Safety, which is an organization that is funded by Michael Bloomberg. and she received lots of funding from various unions. So she broke the all-time record this time for spending in a governor's race. The Oregon legislative races since 1996 have increased in expenditures by a factor of 10. Back in 1996, it was about a little bit less than $4 million was spent overall by all candidates in legislative races. And by the year 2014, that had increased to $28 million, and now it's around, it's maintained around $28 million in the last 3 election cycles. The amount of money that is spent by the top candidates is truly astounding. An Oregon House race can be won with about 10 or 12,000 votes, maybe 14,000, depending upon the turnout. Some candidates for the Oregon House now spend on their campaigns, raise and spend on their campaigns over $1 million to win a House race. That's like $100 per vote that they receive. In 2016, for example, if you took just the top 10 candidates for the House, the top 10 spending candidates for Oregon House, the average that they spent on their campaigns was $825,000 each.
Wow.
The Senate was actually less expensive. The top 10 Senate candidates that year only spent $609,000 each. But then again, in 2018, that increased to $627,000 each. So these are amounts that are absolutely astounding. The Oregonian did a study a couple of years ago and determined that on a per capita basis, Oregon candidates' races are the most expensive in the United States except for New Jersey. And of course, in New Jersey, the candidates in the southern part of the state have to buy into the Philadelphia media market. The candidates in the northern part of the state have to buy into the New York City media market, and that's why their races are so expensive. Oregon does not have those kinds of very expensive media markets. Nevertheless, Oregon candidates spend almost as much money as do those in New Jersey. And I would very much recommend that viewers take a look at the recent series of articles in the Oregonian called "Polluted by Money" by the reporter Rob Davis. So just Google Oregonian "Polluted by Money," and you'll see a series of articles that demonstrates what happens when you have a system that's dominated by big money. Particularly, his articles are mostly about how big money controls the legislature, particularly when it comes to environmental issues, and that policies persist in Oregon that allow environmental destruction that is simply not allowed, not even close, in California or Washington. We are very much the outliers when it comes to the environment, and we have some documentation of that later on. You might say, well, so what? So what if candidates spend a lot of money? That doesn't mean that they all win. Sometimes a candidate doesn't spend very much money and still wins. But I looked up the numbers, and it turns out in the last 2 election cycles for the legislature, the candidate who spent the most money won 96% of the contested seats in 2014. That did go down to only 92% of the contested seats in 2016.
Only
92%. Oregon also has one of the lowest rates of turnover in the legislature of any state. And it has one of the very much highest rates of incumbents winning and of incumbents spending more than their challengers. So we have a kind of an ossified, calcified system in Oregon. Other states, 45 other states, have limits on campaign contributions. When it comes to governors, there are many states that have limits of $1,000 or less and ban corporate and union contributions in governor's races. Alaska's limit is $500 per person, Colorado $575, Connecticut $250, New Hampshire and Rhode Island and West Virginia and Massachusetts are $1,000. Washington recently raised its limit a little bit and is $2,000. But can you imagine $2,000 being the maximum amount that a person can contribute that Phil Knight could contribute in Washington,
yes,
when he contributes only $3.425 million in Oregon? Limits in other states on amounts that can be contributed in legislative races are, of course, much less. In Colorado, it's 200. Montana, 170. Kansas, 500. Maine, 400. Wisconsin, 500. So again, in Oregon legislative races, it's not unusual to have individuals contributing $50,000 to a race, and to having unions and corporations also contributing those kinds of amounts.
That's an investment. They look at it, right? And it's
No doubt.
not good for us, but investment for their company for the financial well-being.
Right.
Well, and one thing that always amazes me, though, too, is that it's like the nuclear arms race. This constant buildup of arms to be able to, to be able to defeat your enemy. It's kind of personified in with these candidates. They have to raise the money because if they're outspent by their opponent, they're not going to be able to keep their seat or not be able to get the seat.
Or to defeat public good, for one thing.
Right,
We're talking about
God
environmental
forbid.
factors, health, et cetera. Yeah.
But it just makes so much sense to me that it's inevitable that that money is going to taint your opinion, is going to change your
Absolutely.
opinion or skew it towards the person that gave you that money. It's inevitable.
In the litigation over the validity of the contribution limits in Multnomah County and Portland, we submitted several affidavits of former and current office holders indicating how money influences their votes, and how in Oregon at the legislature there are individual lobbyists who have many different clients in many different fields. And we have testimony that the lobbyists will tell the candidate, well, if you don't vote for HB 21 or whatever it is that they want you to vote for, not only will my forest products client not contribute to you, but none of my clients will ever contribute to you. And so our system of lobbying also allows the influence of money to be multiplied at the Oregon legislature. Nevertheless, I think that we did achieve a milestone of the Oregon legislature in this past session. On the last day of the legislature, the House passed, and the Senate had already passed, SJR 18, which refers to voters in the November 2020 election an amendment to the Oregon Constitution to eliminate and reverse that 1997 decision that I referred to.
Wow.
So it would from then on not allow the Oregon Supreme Court to say that Oregon's freedom of speech clause mandates and eliminates any opportunity for limits on contributions.
And just to mention this too, as a side point, the intention of the advocates for campaign finance reform was to have to gather the signatures required to get a ballot measure on a constitutional amendment on the ballot for statewide vote. The fact that this came through the legislature saved our campaign a lot of money, but it did give the politicians an opportunity to claim a win, to be able to claim that they are doing the will of the people, working for the good of the people. It will be interesting, though, how if they do anything with this, try to manipulate it in the upcoming special session. So.
Yeah, the SJR 18, the proposed constitutional amendment, is not perfect, but it does say that the Legislative Assembly or the governing body of a city, county, municipality, or district empowered by law or by this Constitution to enact legislation, or the people through the initiative process may enact laws or ordinances within its jurisdiction that, and then it goes on, to limit contributions made in connection with political campaigns or to influence the outcome of an election, or to require disclosure of contributions or expenditures made in connection with political campaigns or to influence the outcome of any election, or to require that an advertisement made in connection with a political campaign or to influence the outcome of any election identify the persons or entities that paid for the advertisement, and delimit expenditures made in connection with political campaigns, et cetera, to the extent permitted under the Constitution of the United States. So it's certainly a worthwhile
series of goals. I mean, excellent.
Yeah, it's a worthwhile amendment to enact, and it will be in front of voters in November of 2020.
Don't generally like 70 or 80% of voters want there to be limitations on campaign donations and dark money and so on? It's an incredibly high number.
Well, we found in Multnomah County, the actual vote was 89% for it, and in Portland in 2018, the actual vote was 87.4%, and that was after, you know, we activists ran a campaign for it, but we didn't do any paid media. We didn't have any TV or radio ads. We produced a large tabloid brochure and mailed that to around 50,000 voters, which isn't very many for the county or Portland. We just, you know, used the state voter file to find out who were the most frequent voters who had voted for out of the last 4 times, and so we sent it to them. So, yeah, the people, I think, are quite outraged by this. In the meantime, the legislature did take a stab at limiting contributions in this last session. It was the bill numbered HB 2714, but you know, we found out that, well, I guess it just confirmed that the legislature is not serious when it comes to campaign contribution limits themselves. What they did is that they finally proposed, and this went back and forth dozens of times, and there were dozens of improvements made to the original bill, which was completely 100% meaningless. But the sticking point and the way it ended up, it didn't pass, by the way. It did pass the House, but then it was killed in the Senate. And it was killed in the Senate by a combination of Republicans not wanting any limits and liberal Democrats not wanting these limits because they're actually counterproductive. They would have limited individuals, for example, to contributing $2,800 to a statewide candidate, which is still quite high, but it would have allowed the caucus committees of the legislature to accept unlimited money from political party committees, candidate committees, and that included all candidate committees for local, state, and federal office. So this is a way that would have enabled a single wealthy individual to still contribute $1 million. Because what you would do is, if I'm limited to contributing $2,800 per statewide candidate, let's say I'm a Democrat. I want to help the Democratic Party and their candidates. They've got 5 statewide candidates, at least. If you don't count the primary, then they probably have 10. Okay, I'll contribute $2,800 to each of those. And then I can also contribute $1,500 to all the state Senate candidates. Okay, there are going to be 15 of those races, so maybe there are 15 or 20 running. I contribute $1,000. That's another $30,000 to them. I can also contribute $1,000 to any House candidate. So there's 60 of those. That's another 60 grand, and it's all coming from one person.
Right.
And anybody can form a candidacy for anything and not really run. That is, you can have a phony candidacy, costs nothing, and takes 5 minutes to create online, and I can give them $1,000 each. So all of that money, according to the bill that the Democratic leadership wanted, all of that money could then be funneled from the candidates who received it to the Legislative Caucus Committee. Right. And then the Legislative Caucus Committee could put that money wherever they want it.
Right.
So it was a very gigantic gaping loophole. There's a similar gaping loophole in how they wanted limits not to apply to political party committees. So we said, you know, this doesn't really, this is not a good reform that is leaving some parties effectively unlimited while having limits on everyone else is not a fair outcome. So we didn't support it. And it did not pass the Senate.
You know, and it's interesting, too, it didn't really address, and this was the big elephant in the room when it came to these discussions with the legislators about campaign finance reform, and that was the ability of independent expenditures to be made on and influence political campaigns. You know, what we're talking about here is intra-party money manipulation and money flow. And so, yeah, they tried to give themselves a little loophole here to allow for the strength of these party committees to be able to influence the outcome. But you still could form very easily a PAC in the state of Oregon, same process as a campaign committee, and be able to donate money to that and not have to disclose it, and be able to fund it and not have to disclose your donors. Am I correct on that?
Not exactly, but we can get into more of it. The other thing that the other thing that Oregon has a problem with is disclosure of where the money is coming from in political campaigns. Before 2001, Oregon had a law that still every other state has, that requires that campaign ads at least identify the source of the ad. The Oregon legislature gleefully repealed that in 2001. Of course, I testified against the repeal, but they didn't listen to me, as usual. And Governor Kitzhaber signed it immediately. The other thing that Oregon does not have is any requirement that any political ad identify the funders of the ad. Now, there are 11 states.
The slides will work now.
Ah, well, what do we have here? Boop. Oregon lacks disclosure. Can we show that?
Right. There we go.
Now we'll have to start the show over.
No. Well, you can, but very, very illuminating. Very illuminating.
So these states that are on this list have required that political ads identify their source and their funding. California requires that the top 5 funders to the campaign be identified in every ad. And these other states require either 5 or in some cases 3. And Washington recently, just this year, amended their statute. They required the top 5 funders, and now they say if any of the top 5 funders are a political committee, then the ad also has to identify the top 3 actual funders to that political committee.
Wow, that's a great idea, isn't
That really
it? My
is.
gosh.
It goes down a level as far as trying to ascertain who those donors are.
The way these work, I think these are very effective also in combating large independent expenditures. The Chevron Corporation attempted to take over the city of Richmond, California in 2014. The Richmond City Council was thinking about adopting an ordinance to require Chevron to notify the city when Chevron was emitting large clouds of toxic gas.
Sounds reasonable to.
Well, Chevron decided we'd rather not do that. We would rather take over the city entirely.
Which was probably cheaper for them to do, and they did this cost plus cost analysis.
They thought so.
Assuming, yes, with the assumption that they would win.
Right, right.
So they spent $3 million. They recruited their own slate of candidates for the city council and mayor. Spent $3 million to promote them ads, brochures, billboards, TV ads, radio ads. But the California law required that all of the ads state on them somewhere major funding from Chevron Inc.
Yeah, deal breaker.
All of their candidates lost overwhelmingly, despite outspending their opponents 50 to 1.
That's amazing.
So, having voters know who's paying for the ad allows them to evaluate the credibility of the ad. And if the ad is from a tobacco company promoting a candidate, you probably know that that's
Poison.
not somebody you want to vote for.
But got back to Nike, right? And the head of Nike, he certainly didn't want his contribution to be known. And for Neil Butler, I mean, that would have been the kiss of death for. I would imagine.
Under these tagline laws in other states, every ad by Newt Bueller would have had to say,
Phil Knight.
Funded by Phil Knight, former CEO of Nike.
Great for sales.
And in our Portland measure, we actually also require that the amount of money be disclosed. So it would have to say, funded by Phil Knight, former CEO of Nike, who contributed $3.425 million to this campaign. And our tagline requirements in Portland and Multnomah County require that you not only identify the name of the person or corporation, but the businesses that they're engaged in. Because, for example, I gave you the example of ADEC Corporation, very big medical campaign contributor in Oregon. Probably 99% of Oregonians don't know what it does. It makes dental equipment. So they should have to identify the businesses that they are in. So both the Portland and the Multnomah measures require that the top 5 funders of the campaign that is putting on the ad, whether it's the candidate, him or herself, or whether it's an independent expenditure campaign, the top 5 funders have to be identified in the ad itself. And so we, of course, went to the legislature in this session and said that's what the legislature should adopt statewide. Instead, they adopted HB 2716, which I characterize on this slide as a weak taglines bill, and I think that's charitable. It supposedly requires that ads supporting or opposing candidates for public office disclose some of their funders, but in fact it does almost nothing. First of all, it doesn't apply at all to candidates putting, candidate campaigns. They can continue to run their campaigns and not identify in their ads any of their funders. It does not apply to for-profit businesses or individuals who only have to disclose themselves and not their funders. Well, this is a gigantic loophole. In Oregon, you can create a for-profit corporation with $100 and 5 minutes online. Okay, I'm now a for-profit corporation. I will now fund some independent expenditure ads for or against the candidate, and all I have to disclose under the bill that the legislature passed is my corporate name. And it can be, my corporate name could be the Good Things for Oregon Corporation.
Yeah, right. From Oregon.
So that's totally worthless. The additional weaknesses here is that while it does apply to non-candidate political committees making independent expenditures, it requires only persons who have contributed $10,000 or more to be disclosed, and each of those could be nice-sounding political committee names or nonprofit corporation names. And the ads don't need to name the donors that are charitable organizations. The problem with it is that simply by creating one or two political committees, nice-sounding political committees, which you can do also in 5 minutes, it costs nothing, or one or two either for-profit or nonprofit corporations, cost $100, takes 5 minutes, you can run your ads and never disclose anything except things like, Oregonians for Great Things Committee, funded by the Corporation for Oregon Benefit or whatever. So totally evadable, not difficult. It also has other problems, which are limited here. So 2716, as I said to Oregon Public Broadcasting the other day, it's borderline meaningless. I think that's charitable. Oregon has also a problem with disclosures of funding of politicians through the ORSTAR system. Basically, every few months, the Oregonian or other journalists will publish a report about some quirk in Oregon law that prevents people from really knowing where money is coming from two politicians. Here's a quirk that was reported last year. Donations from anonymously run corporations are legal. A company's name alone satisfies Oregon laws requiring candidates to list sources of donations, even if company documents don't list the actual owners. So there you go. It's the Oregon Wonderful Corporation, and that's all that you have to disclose, even to ORSTAR, even to the funding reporting system. Another quirk. Nearly half the money raised by a leading Republican gubernatorial candidate cannot be traced because it comes from two out-of-state corporations that don't have to disclose their principals. Here's another. Loophole makes it tough. The public can see only single transactions. If a candidate passes contributions to another candidate or a re-election fund for party members, public can no longer see the money's original donor. These funding pass-throughs, as this indicate, happened in the last cycle only 2,800 times in the last 3 election cycles. 2,000. Candidates transferred about $19 million among themselves. It means that a quarter of all money involved in legislative campaigns is hard to trace as it moves through the system. So that's another feature that Oregon has in its law, unlimited, what we call PAC-to-PAC transfers that most states also don't allow because it allows candidates to obscure their sources of funding. In order to determine, and really in Oregon, these candidates who are spending $1 million on a House race, in order to determine where their money is really coming from, it's virtually impossible in the ORSTAR system. Because you go into the system and they're getting $50,000 contributions from various political committees. So then you have to look up each political committee. And those political committees are getting large contributions from other candidates. So you have to look up the other candidates. And they're getting money from a bunch of other political committees. So you have to look up those political committees. And they're getting money from corporations. And it's virtually impossible to trace.
And Dan, let me understand
Theme of the
something.
show.
There was a time when there were limits prior to the Veneta decision in 1970, or pardon me, in 1997.
1996 cycle.
1996. Prior to that, I mean, well, much of these shenanigans are directly related to that ruling, in the sense of these are pretty blatant attempts to try to game and obfuscate the system, to hide donors, to hide the true funding of political candidates and the PACs. Has this always been the standard? This type of money manipulation, or was it like that? Was it cleaner before 1997?
Before 1997, candidates were only required to report to the state their sources of contributions twice a year, because that was before the age of computers, basically. And so, for the most part, the system did not require, the donors weren't disclosed at all. There was a reporting period in January, there was a reporting period in September. So basically you had to wait until September of the election year to find out where some of the money was coming from. If money came in after that, that was almost impossible to trace. The candidates did have to do after election reports, but of course that's after the election, so you can't decide who to vote for on the basis of their sources of funding. So the system was far worse before the advent of computers, and these PAC-to-PAC transfers really have grown up after the advent of computers, because they are a mechanism for scrambling the information that would otherwise be available to voters. Before computers, there was no need to scramble the information, because it just wasn't. It was only available right at the end of the election cycle anyway. So the legislature also addressed this problem with HB 2983, which this slide indicates we call the Weak Disclosure Bill. It supposedly requires nonprofit corporations to report to the Secretary of State their largest donors, but in fact it does almost nothing. It doesn't apply to any entity that spends less than $100,000 regarding a statewide candidate or measure, or $25,000 regarding a legislative candidate. Doesn't apply to any entity that spends any amount on other candidate races, county, city, etc. The most important problem is the second one here. It doesn't require donors that are nice-sounding corporations to disclose their sources of funding. So you can do the same thing here. Just form a corporation, call it the Oregon Improvement Corporation. You can accept infinite money from the Make Oregon Great Corporation and not disclose the source of funds for the Make Oregon Great Corporation, and then you're home free. You've complied with the statute, and you haven't really disclosed anything. This is much worse than the system that was adopted in Multnomah County and Portland, where independent expenditures have to register as political committees and report to the Secretary of State all of their contributions and expenditures. Ads must name the top 5 true original sources, and political committees have to then, if top 5 sources of political committee, the political committee then has to reveal its top 3 sources and the businesses they're engaged in. And we adopted this in Portland in the fall of 2018, and then I noticed the state of Washington copied it.
Good.
In the spring of 2019, they did the same thing. They said, okay, if one of your top funders is a political committee, then you have to also identify the top 3 funders to that committee.
Which just makes logical sense.
Heck yes.
Yeah. And what's encouraging to me is how Multnomah County and the city of Portland are becoming standards of care, if you will.
Best practices.
Best practices. Yeah. We're ironing out. We have the opportunity to iron out a lot of these regulations and be able to work the kinks out of the system before it becomes applied on a statewide level. Would you agree with that?
I would. And I think in particular, we're getting cooperation from the city of Portland.
Yes.
They're ready to go, and the tagline requirement has already been upheld by Multnomah County Circuit Court, and no one is appealing it. So that will go into effect on September 1st. After September 1st, all political ads involving candidates for Portland City Council or City Auditor will have to disclose their top 5 funders.
And mayor?
And mayor.
And mayor.
And the contribution limits are in place. They have not been enjoined. And so those are 5. So those are no corporate contributions, no union contributions. Each individual can contribute only $500. Folks can form small donor committees, which are committees which have never accepted any contribution from any source other than an individual in amounts of $100 or less per individual per year. And those small donor committees can aggregate contributions and then use those to support or oppose candidates for office. That kind of addresses the problem that a lot of people, except the elite, don't have a lot of time to research candidates and get involved in issues. They have to work 1 or 2 jobs, go home, try to take care of the kids. So they can essentially provide small amounts of funding to groups that they trust to then move the money along either in the form of independent expenditures for or against candidates or contributions directly to candidates.
You know, one thing that also occurred in the city of Portland's version of this is what I always refer to as the 4th leg of the stool when it comes to campaign finance reform, and that is public funding of elections. If I understand correctly, in the mayor's race, we now have a candidate there that's been doing that is advocating, that has been talking to voters, encouraging it's 6-to-1 match. Now, it's a little different than what we're doing here in the legislation that we've been working on here, but it's a natural complement. Once you have the transparency, once you have the ability for the public to be able to have as much influence as the corporations, then in turn you get public funding of elections, and anyone can run, and anyone can.
Virtuous cycle, I guess
Correct.
you'd say.
Yeah, good way of putting it.
And in the Portland system, Portland City Council adopted the public funding system a few years ago. It won't be in effect until 2020. That'll be the first cycle. It is unique in that it is, until our measure passed in 2018, the only public funding system of elections, of campaigns in the United States that would have operated in the absence of limits on private contributions. So in every other system, the candidate can choose between participating in the public funding system and limiting their contributions to like $100 per person, or not participating and instead being able to accept contributions of up to, let's say, $500 per person. In the Portland system, they would have been able to opt out of public funding and then accept unlimited contributions from private sources, corporations, unions, individuals, et cetera. So it still wouldn't, I think it would have greatly undermined the public funding system.
Right.
So we fixed that by now in Portland, candidate can either accept the public funding and contributions of up to $250, I think, per person.
That's correct.
Or they can opt out and accept contributions of $500 per person. So it's it prevents the public funding system and the publicly funded candidate from being overwhelmed by private contributions.
Well, and you know, in this mayor's race is going to be a dandy here coming up, because you have candidates right now that are really grassroots, that are really talking to voters, working on it. It's a 6-to-1 match, so if you contribute $50, that is equivalent to $250 for that candidate. So they're out there pushing it, and the question will be whether or not Mayor Ted Wheeler decides to also follow that and be a participant in the city public financing.
I would guess he will.
If he's smart, you know, if he's wise, because it sure won't look very good if he doesn't.
And if he doesn't, he still won't be able to take big money from contributors, as he has in the past.
Right.
We have.
And you know, and let me just dovetail this into, I can see what your next slide is. What is exciting to me about campaign finance reform, Caleb, is how across the board the support has been. Allies being created that haven't been allies in the past, coming together on the campaign finance reform the topic. I know you have a slide that shows the diversity of
Well, we have to go to 2 slides now. Our coalition has been getting bigger.
That's a good thing.
And it ranges from a few unions, not many. The letter carriers is one of them, and NAACP is there. 350 PDX, which is an environmental group. League of Women Voters, and political groups all over the place. Many parties: Independent Party, Progressive Party, Multnomah Democratic Party, Green Party, on the next page. And lots of public interest organizations and advocacy organizations. Here's the second page: Green Party, tax fairness. All sorts of organizations are now supporting us. Here are the press endorsements for the Portland measure, and this is very strange. While we expected to get the endorsements of the Portland Mercury and the Scanner, and Willamette Week and Street Roots, we did not expect to get the endorsement of the Portland Oregonian. In 2016, the Oregonian editorialized against the basically identical measure for Multnomah County. By 2018, they had changed completely and advocated for the measure. And at the legislature in this past session, the Oregonians' editorial position was to the left of us. The Oregonian editorialized several times that the legislature needed to adopt actual meaningful limits on campaign contributions, and not this thing, not HB 2714, which identified as being full of loopholes. So the Oregonian is supporting this now on two levels. It's supporting it in editorials, and it's also supporting it in its reporting. Rob Davis continues to do stories about how money is determining the outcome, particularly of environmental causes, and we can get into that. But I'm suspecting we are
running. Yes,
running a little bit
we
low.
have 13 minutes, 12 minutes.
You
So.
notice the clock above the TV.
Well, in that case,
With that, though, I might renew my Oregonian. I canceled it 5 years ago, but that is great.
Well, I think it goes to show the broad public realization that of the influence that money is having on politics. And it's a very obvious attempt. I think it's an attempt to try to reclaim that power.
Good for you guys.
In campaign finance reform is.
The Knights.
And so, onward we go, onward and upward. But when you have the Oregonian,
Yes.
backing you, you know
Good for
that you're in the mainstream, perhaps.
So just one example of how Oregon's regime of unlimited contributions and spending affects environmental policies. This chart indicates that despite the fact that Oregon politicians congratulate themselves all the time about how green they are and how wonderful they are in reducing greenhouse gases, in fact, they're not being reduced. The blue line indicates the actual experience in calculated emissions of greenhouse gases in Oregon. Those other red lines and yellow lines are various projections of what would happen with various policies. But the blue line is history, and it doesn't look very good. Oregon has not appreciably reduced greenhouse gases since 1990. In fact, it's above the level from 1990. One particular problem Oregon has is with diesel engines. Multnomah County ranks in the worst 1% of U.S. counties for diesel particulate pollution, the worst 2% for cancer risk. Portland is the worst city nationwide for respiratory distress.
I didn't know that.
I did not know.
Said the Environmental Protection Agency National Air Toxic Assessment at the end of 2015. People don't realize that. EPA said that diesel pollution in Oregon results in 460 premature deaths per year and $4.5 billion in health costs and lost productivity. I mean, it's incredible when you think about it. Diesel pollution is very dangerous because it's small particles. It's particles that are so small that once they get into the lungs, they cannot get out. They are too small for the cilia and the lining of the lung to beat them back out of the, so that you can't cough them out. And the cilia does not bring them out with mucus. They're just stuck there forever. Oregon is a diesel dump. The Oregonian back in 2015 wrote, Oregon has become a dumping ground for California's old polluting diesel rigs. 350,000 trucks in California are being phased out because they fail to meet the state's stricter standards. Trucking companies have found willing buyers in Oregon where
Welcome to
environmental standards
Oregon.
are looser. Same in Washington. The Washington dirty diesels are coming here. California's tighter rules. Newer trucks emit 90% less soot, known as a carcinogen. Health problems, lung cancer, heart attacks, low birth weights, asthma, et cetera, is traceable to the diesel pollution. So what is Oregon doing? Nothing. Very close to nothing. Mm-hmm. Oregon, the legislature passed the bill, which they congratulated themselves for in this past session, HB 2017, which allows the dirtiest diesel engines, that is, it doesn't matter how old or dirty they are, to continue to operate in Oregon until 2025. It's another 6 years. And then they phase out the use of diesel engines in trucks, but not in construction equipment. A lot of diesel engines are in construction equipment, and this doesn't even control them at all. And even trucks, it only applies to trucks that are registered in 3 Oregon counties, the tri-state area, the tri-county area. And then, even so, it exempts all trucks that are used in agriculture or logging. It exempts all fleets of 5 or fewer trucks, no matter how old or dirty. It exempts any truck that claims that it's being used for less than 5,000 miles a year. It exempts all non-vehicle engines, that is construction equipment. Mm-hmm. And it spends this source of this fund of money that comes from the Volkswagen settlement. Volkswagen produced diesel cars that had a fraudulent trick in their computer systems that would trick emission measurements. So it would say that the car was only emitting 1% of its actual emissions.
Right.
So Volkswagen settled for several $1 billion, and the Oregon fund, Oregon got a share of that fund, but they can only use it to subsidize the purchase of new diesel engines, when it would be far more efficient and cleaner to substitute electric engines for much of the equipment and for trucks, and to substitute in place of large diesel trucks running around downtown areas, substitute small hybrid human electric powered tricycles, which is being done in 80 European cities now have fleets of electric hybrid human electric powered tricycles doing the deliveries that in Portland and in the United States are done by large diesel trucks.
Wow. Is there a direct correlation between these sobering stats in regards to diesel engines and campaign finance reform?
Well,
and the need for campaign finance reform?
Washington has much stricter limits on diesel equipment and vehicles, and has limits on campaign contributions, and requires political ads to identify their funders. Right. California has much stringent controls, has limits on campaign contributions, and requires that political ads identify their funders. Right. Oregon and Washington both have regulation of aerial spraying of pesticides. Oregon doesn't. So the Oregonian articles by Rob Davis go into great depth, polluted by money, Google polluted by money, go into great depth about the differences between Oregon's environmental lack of regulation versus Washington and California, and directly attributes that to campaign contributions, has direct examples of how bills were killed, how regulations at the administrative level were killed by large campaign contributors. It's really extremely sobering.
And I think it's many people, many Oregonians, feel that we're this paragon of environmental purity.
I'm green, you're green.
Correct. And then to have that very sobering reminder that no, we're not, and here's why: because of the influence of these of these polluters to
hidden
be able
money.
to, the hidden money, exactly. So things to consider as we vote in 2020 for SJR 18 when it gets onto the ballot. It'll be a first step towards.
So what should we be looking for then, Dan? Or expecting, or praying for, whatever?
First thing is I guess, praying for a good decision from the Oregon Supreme
Yes.
Court. The oral argument is November 1st in Salem. I wouldn't expect the court to make a decision probably until early 2020. Of course, there's no deadline for them to make a decision. The next thing the legislature needs to do is write the ballot title for SJR 18. The legislature passed a bill that instead of having the Attorney General write the ballot title, which is normal, the legislature itself will write the ballot title. And so we need to get good folks appointed to the committee that will write the ballot title and the explanatory statement and the fiscal impact statement. And to get something written that will be accurate for the voters to consider in the voters pamphlet for November 2020. The other thing we need to do is perhaps in the February, Oregon has a short session of the legislature in February of each even-numbered year, only lasts a month. So in that session, perhaps we could get meaningful amendments to the bills we talked about here to require actual taglines that actually disclose the sources of funding for political ads, and to get actual disclosure of funds that are being spent by nonprofit organizations for independent expenditures, get meaningful limits, meaningful controls, and perhaps even to get meaningful limits on the amounts of political contributions, although I kind of doubt that can be done in the February session. And our experience in this past session, which was the 6-month-long session, was that there are very much entrenched interests at the legislature that they're not willing to give up their to in any way compromise their own ability to access effectively unlimited money.
Well, one thing I can say is that we, the people that are watching this show and living in this beautiful state, can do something to help. And you can, we have a website. Dan has a website, honest-elections.com. You can learn more about the background and get involved at that website. Caleb, it's sobering information.
You guys come back. This has been such a lot of information. So let me just say, we are Progressive Radio and TV. We're here the first Tuesday of the month from 8 to 9. We're enjoying two wonderful people, Moses Ross and attorney Dan Meek, and you guys are just doing God's work. I mean, really, that is just so impressive. Maybe you'll come back in the near future? Or?
Absolutely. Hopefully we'll be able to come back after and give a good report from the short session. And then next year, look for the SJR 18, the ballot measure that addresses campaign contribution limits in our Oregon Constitution. Make sure to vote for that and get involved in the campaign to make sure that it passes. If the history is any indication, 89% in Multnomah County, 87% in the city of Portland. I venture to say this is going to pass with a very large majority.
Well, and we'll see what sort of opposition develops among the corporate community. Also, just Google Honest Elections Oregon, and that will get you to our website. We'll come up #1, Honest Elections Oregon.
And that's not just a platitudinous name. That's the real deal.
That's true.
Very good.
Not euphonious.
Yes.
I'd ring out a warning, I'd ring out love between my brothers and my